The committee will come to order. We will now resume consideration of the legislative branch appropriations bill. Seeing no other members wishing to, I'm looking around to make sure I'm wishing to make opening remarks, I would like to recognize Chairman, I do this. I'll never get that. To offer the manager's amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the manager's amendment that we have worked on collaboratively on the committee. I'll run through a quick summary of it. In the report, we'll talk about the report language. Sergeant at Arms will be doing the work in terms of taking a look at district office safety and reporting back to the committee with recommendations after they've had a chance to be kind of comprehensive across various and sundry urban, rural districts, the whole 9 yards. The chief administrative officer will be doing some work about allergy safety in house dining facilities. The chief administrator confliction tool for scheduling committee meetings, something that would just be nice to have. There's never been a conflict in any of that, but we think it's important and worth giving a try. Capitol Police, general expenses, there was an issue about release of Inspector General reports, and so there's language in there talking about how to speed that up and support that general process. The Congressional Budget Office, there's some administrative changes. Instead of saying scoring, it will be analysis of legislation. I'm sure that will make it all much better received by all concerned. Architect of the Capitol, construction operations, Inspector General, submission planning. The committee supports the bipartisan efforts of the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, the Committee on House Administration, to reform the appointment process for architect of the Capitol. As you know, historically that person was appointed by the president, and with the recent problems with the former architect of the Capitol, it revealed some stuff that was, shall we say, clunky in terms of who's got the authority and who they really work for. So this is an attempt to say they really work for us, and we ought to be the ones that are primarily on first base in that. Library of Congress Research Service, when you talk about detailees, those lines have gotten a little bit blurred, so this is an attempt to make that clear in terms of how that process works and how they will detail. And with that, Madam Chair, I would yield back.
Mr. Esbiat is recognized now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do not object to the chairman's manager's amendment, and thank you, and I yield back.
What? Is this a person?
Yes, you recognize him to close.
Okay, yeah, I recognize Chairman for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
The questions on the amendment, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Oh, I like that response. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is adopted.
Way to help.
Are there any further amendments? Okay, there's nothing.
Yeah, he wants
Yeah, there. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will read the amendment.
an amendment by Mr. Espaillat. In the bill, page 7, line 9, until expended, insert for salaries and expenses of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, $3 million, of which $1 million shall remain available until expended. Page 7, line 8, strike $213,072,000 and insert $210,000.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member is recognized for opening remarks on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member DeLauro. I rise in support of my amendment to restore funding for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Of course, diversity is essential to the structure of our nation, and we all seek to have a government that's representative of our nation, the composition of our nation. Imagine a government with no women, or imagine a government even without regional representation. No one from the South, from the West, the North, or the East, or imagine a government without African American, Latino, Asian Americans. It will truly not be representative of the people of this great country. ODI's mission is not controversial at all, to foster diversity among House employing offices so that the House workforce reflects the diversity of America. ODI also conducts work on a non-partial and bipartisan basis. ODI has done tremendous work to help diversify and retain staff for all of our offices, although we recognize, as was mentioned earlier, and the numbers bear that we need to do much better. So striking ODI from the House rules shouldn't even be a topic of debate right now. Congressional staffers undoubtedly make a direct impact on the lives of well-being of millions of Americans, and these staffers reflect our rich diversity. It is critical to promote policies that help Congress in hiring and retaining a diverse workforce, and ODI does just that. So for these reasons, Madam Chair, I support this amendment. I think it's crucial to our work here and to our constituencies across America to feel when they walk into our offices that they see themselves as well. It is important that they see themselves in our offices and feel as though our offices are welcoming to them. So for that reason, I will be voting for this amendment, and I urge all my other colleagues to do the same.
Mr. Amadei is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Espaillat's amendment would reinstate the House's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which has been eliminated in the bill. Efforts are underway to reorganize and streamline certain activities in the House, including a planned reorganization of the Chief Administrative Office and restructuring functions in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. While the office is being eliminated, functions of the office will continue to be performed in a more efficient and cost-effective manner without focusing on identity politics. The bill is consistent as it exists with administrative restructuring to streamline human resource activities consistent with the direction of the Committee on House Administration. Hiring the best person for the job in any agency or office under this bill is encouraged. There are currently multiple staff support offices focused on human resources that can be reorganized and streamlined into one. The Chief Administrative Office, which is customer-focused and best suited to create a house-wide Office of Talent and Development. ODI was created under House rules as its own office, but will be moving and repurposed under the CAO to become part of the new Office of Talent and Development. By this restructuring, we expect an increase in accessibility to the HR resources provided to House staff by creating a one-stop shop while also saving millions by streamlining duplicative efforts. Not only will the reorganization make activities more efficient, but it will help in oversight of them. I urge rejection of this amendment, and I just want to add one thing that kind of goes along historical lines, which is the office was created in the last Congress or the Congress before. Good intentions, I get all that. But when you look at the way the money that was specifically appropriated to them, for them to use as they want, there was $15,000 on staff retreat at the Salamander, thousands of taxpayers' dollars on customized swag, including windbreakers, tens of thousands of dollars on partisan diversity events for Black History Month and Women's History Month, as well as $25,000 for racial equity group training. The office went over a year without a director as the majority party at the time failed to fill the position and even put one of their own staffers down there temporarily in an acting capacity while serving as the assigned oversight staffer for House Admin Democrats. A clear conflict of interest. Use taxpayer dollars to give away gift cards to staff for attending their programming and spending that is not allowed in any other context, which could raise ethics questions. Now, I'm not saying that to impugn or offend. I am saying that as the predicate for, this is a function which should continue, but this particular function needs some supervision. And so placing it in CAO, an existing portfolio, and by the way, if anybody wants to stand up and say you've defunded it, their funding has been cut. That is an absolute truth. But it hasn't been eliminated, and what hasn't been eliminated goes over to CAO to support the continuation of those functions. I urge a no vote. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Ms. Lee, Ms. Lee of California is recognized.
Madam Chair, and I want to thank the gentleman for offering this amendment. Yes, this does attempt to defund the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the base bill, so I thank the gentleman for this amendment. You know, I was one of the first African-American women as a senior staffer to a former member of Congress, I say in the day. There were very few women, people of color, and gay staffers. We've come a long way, but let me tell you, we have a long way to go. Our job to represent everyone in this country is exactly what our job is. We make our jobs much more difficult when we do not provide resources that allow everyone, regardless of race, gender identity, or other personal characteristics, equal opportunities. That's what the Republican majority continues to do, trying to exclude people from participating in this legislative branch of government. Now, let me tell you, this does not happen by accident. The history of racism and discrimination and gender inequality and discrimination against gay individuals in this country, it really impacts us all in ways that we can plainly see, but also in ways that are harder to see. Eliminating diversity programs is essentially sticking our heads in the sand and pretending that all people are treated equally. And you know that's not the case. In fact, the majority of the American people understand that democracy, real democracy, requires constant work. We can't avoid these conversations just because they make us feel uncomfortable. And so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and to reconsider the value of a dedicated office working to have a staff that looks like America. Thank you again, Mr. Espaillat, for the amendment.
Mr. Espaillat is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, this is of critical importance. As they say in New York, Madam Chair, if you're not at the table, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And certainly, having a diverse staff to service our constituencies, at the very least, allows them to feel as though they have a seat at the table and they're not on the menu. And they will be able to get the services that are culturally and linguistically sensitive, so that we could do the people's business in our offices with qualified, highly qualified staff. I don't think this compromises in any way, shape, or form our efforts to get the best qualified person. But we believe that there is quality everywhere. What there is not everywhere is opportunity. And so by allowing young people and others to work with us from diverse backgrounds, we're also fostering opportunities. And I think that this is an amendment whose spirit is about opportunity and fair representation and a representative government. So I urge again all my colleagues to vote in the affirmative.
Mr. What? Oh, the question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Espaillat, and all of those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the
I'm asking for a roll call, please.
okay. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of the recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number is supported. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Okay.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, yes. Mr. Amaday.
No.
Mr. Amaday, no. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, no. Mr. Bishop.
Yes.
Mr. Bishop, yes. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, yes. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, yes. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, no. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, yes. Ms. DeLauro.
Aye.
Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Espaillat.
Aye.
Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, aye. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, no. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, no. Mr. Gonzalez.
We did this.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Do this.
Ms. Granger. No.
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Guest.
3.
Mr. Guest, no. Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris. I'm sorry.
Harder voted aye.
I'm sorry.
Harder voted aye.
Mr. Harder, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Mrs. Henson. Mrs. Henson, no. Mr. Hoyer.
Aye.
Mr. Hoyer, aye. Mr. Joyce. No. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter.
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. LaTurner, no. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California, aye. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, aye. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, no. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. Newhouse.
This is next.
Mr. Newhouse, no. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, yes. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, yes. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, yes. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, aye. Ms. Underwood. Ms. Underwood, yes. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, yes. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, yes. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, yes. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke, no. Mr. Elzey, no.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? The clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 25, the noes are 33. The amendment is not adopted.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk, and I request, under unanimous consent, that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member is recognized for opening remarks on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This in-block amendment includes several changes to the bill and report which would further strengthen legislative branch policy initiative. It strikes the plastic waste reduction provision. It restricts funds from being used for diversity, equity, and inclusion training or implementation that promotes or perpetuates divisive concepts. It prohibits funds to discriminate against a person based on religious marriage beliefs. It directs the LOC, Library of Congress, to provide and design an exhibit concept for American exceptionalism. I urge a yes vote on the amendment.
The SPY is recognized. Mr. SPY.
Thank
is
you,
recognized.
Madam Chair. I rise in strong opposition to this en bloc poison pill amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no on it. Amid this existential climate crisis, this amendment eliminates an important tool in our toolbox to combat the climate crisis, reducing plastic waste. Plastic generates heat-trapping gases at every stage of its life cycle. We must follow the science and reduce our emissions for future generations. Just a couple of weeks ago, or last week, we saw the haze here trapping Washington, D.C. and the northeast sector of the country. And this amendment also prohibits funding for diversity and inclusion training again, which is a clear message, obviously, to women, the disabled, the LGBTQI plus community, and historically underrepresented communities. That the message is that they're now welcome in the halls of Congress. And so I cannot in good conscience support this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Pocan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to address one aspect of this, just because it's been introduced in pretty much every bill. And this is, one of the red meat parts that's not so much about appropriations, but about raw meat for some folks. And that's the prohibition of funds for discriminatory actions against a person's beliefs in marriage, about man and a woman. I know you think this is something about protecting religious beliefs, but this is really about legalizing discrimination by the federal government. If it's about religious beliefs, how do we determine whose religious beliefs? There are white Christian nationalists. You have one in your caucus who espouses that she is a white Christian nationalist. We would never say that people who are not Caucasian you can't discriminate against, because that would be incredibly bigoted. Yet that's exactly what we're doing right now against people based on marriage. And let me just share from my perspective, but really my perspective is your staff's perspectives, our committee staff's perspectives, staff at the Library of Congress, our police, and anyone who's affected by this line of the budget. When I got here in 2012, I got elected in 2012, came in 2013. My husband and I were married in 2006 in Toronto, because it wasn't fully legal in the country. It was in certain states, but not everywhere. And when I got here, up to this point, we never had recognized the same-sex partners as spouses. No one else was married. I think we were the first person to come in. But you were a designee, very, very romantic. This is my designee, Phil. And you didn't get the same respect, the benefits of being a spouse. So we fought it for about 3 months. And Nancy Pelosi was tremendous at doing that. And then finally, she called one Friday in March and said, look, they're not going to do it. It's just not going to happen. Do what you have to do with the press. And then she called me back on Monday and goes, wait. John Boehner just said it's not up to him. It's up to the Sergeant at Arms. And they said yes. And we flew my husband out. He was the first person to be officially recognized as a spouse. And we were very proud of that, because that's the way it should be. I'm still on my first marriage, hopefully only marriage. Some of y'all have been on a few. I know you really like marriage that much, but it's been a while. And here's the reality. What you're saying with this is, if a Capitol police officer saw my husband come with a spouse badge, that if they don't believe marriage is between a man and a woman, they could maybe not let them through. Now, that's not a huge thing, but it's still discrimination, because they would decide that that marriage, that's not really a spouse, because it's only between marriage and man and woman. But let me give you something a little more complex. What if it was about the benefits folks? And God forbid I would, have passed away. And I want to make sure that those benefits that I should have from my spouse go to my spouse, but that person in the benefits office doesn't believe in it, and therefore they don't get that. Is that fair? That's clearly discrimination. But that's exactly what you're doing with this amendment. It may be great red meat for some folks, but that's the real effect. And it's not just about me. It's about your staff, our committee staff, the Library of Congress staff, the police. And I just really want you to think about that. And this also stirs up the nuts, honestly, out there. About 5 years ago, we had moved about 9 years out to the country, and I told you a little bit about where I live, and we have to have someone come and plow. And the guy said he wasn't going to plow anymore. When I asked him why, he said, well, your friend. And the way he said it, with the contempt in his voice, it wasn't your husband, it wasn't your spouse, it wasn't your partner, it was your friend. These are the nutbags that you guys fuel when you do this stuff. And I understand there's a part of your base that believes the way they believe, but I don't think they believe I should be discriminated against or anyone else simply for who they love. So I just wanted to say that. And I wish you guys would have an answer for it. And I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to put you on the spot, because we've had enough already today by censuring members for stupid reasons. I'm not going to do that to you. But think about it. When you do this stuff, there is a real effect. And every single bill, when you stuff this in, I mean, you can do it once, right? The crazies will be happy. Oh, look what they did. You don't need to do it every single time and affect your own employees, because that's what you're doing. So I just wanted to address the one aspect, but I want you to know it has a negative effect. It's also discrimination. And I think you'd agree it's discrimination. And I deserve to have the same respect as you all do. And I hope you'll think about that the next time these things are a little easy to put out there, but really think about the actual effects of what they are. And I yield back.
Mr. Amadei is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too support marriage. I've tried it twice. I am one of the most popular ex-husbands in the nation. But I digress. I get what you're saying, and I appreciate that and I respect it. But we all need to think about what we've done in terms of what part of our conferences or our constituencies we're playing to. And to be real direct, speaking only for myself, I think some of that stuff's gone to the point where other people who obviously aren't in think the way you do, think it's gone too far the other way, to the point where it discriminates against them and it has a negative effect on them. And so this is an attempt to go, okay, now the pendulum swung to the other side, and I would just say, I invite you to think about where you had it and where this puts it, and then maybe at some point in time, you try to find what doesn't make somebody, whether it's one side or the other, feel discriminated against or goes too far. And I'll just say this, the nutmeg reference fits a lot of people on any different days. And I appreciate that. I'm just saying, quite frankly, one side saying we're in the majority and we're taking it all one way or the other ain't helping solve the problem. And with that, I urge your adoption of this amendment.
He just closed the debate.
What happened? Do this? Yes, ma'am. The question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Amadei. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No! In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is adopted. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of the recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amadei.
Yes.
Mr. Amadei, yes. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, yes. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, yes. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, yes. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, yes. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, yes. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, yes. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Yes. Mr. Diaz-Balart, yes. Mr. Elzey. Yes. Mr. Elzey, yes. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Yes. Mr. Fleischman, yes. Ms. Frankel. No. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Yes. Mr. Franklin, yes. Mr. Garcia. Yes. Mr. Garcia, yes. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Granger.
Yes.
Ms. Granger, yes. Mr. Guest. Yes. Mr. Guest, yes. Mr. Harder. No. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, yes. Mrs. Henson. Yes. Mrs. Henson, yes. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer. Yes. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. Yes. Mr. Joyce, yes. Ms. Capter. No. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. LaTurner. Aye. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. No. Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. No. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Aye. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCullum. No. Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, yes. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, yes. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, yes. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, yes. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, yes. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, no. Ms. Underwood. Ms. Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, yes. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, yes. Mr. Cuellar is not recorded. Mr. Cuellar, no.
Does any member wish to record their vote on or change their vote? The clerk will tally.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk and ask that it be considered as read. Aguilar amendment. And ask that the reading be dispensed with, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, colleagues. I want to thank you, Chair. I want to thank you, Chair of the committee, Mr. Amade, and to the ranking member of the subcommittee as well. Today, I'm offering an amendment that would allow recipients of the deferred action of childhood arrivals to serve as employees of this institution. Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned in your rousing opening, this is one of the few pieces that we control ourselves. We don't have to ask the White House for permission. We don't have to ask everybody else for permission. This is something that we control the rules of this chamber. And one of the glaring omissions has been the ability of individuals with DACA status, those who know this country as their own, who were raised here and went to school here. They know this is their home. They have been prevented by the rules of the House from being employees of this institution. Over the last 4 years, the language that I'm offering was put in the base bill. But prior to that, just on process, Mr. Chairman, this amendment language passed with members of this body on both sides of the aisle supporting this exact language when Republicans were in control 2 years before that, once by voice and once by a recorded vote. Madam Chair, these individuals deserve every opportunity to succeed in this country, and they have been prevented from serving this body and this institution. Now, we can't fix everything, and I think we all agree that the immigration system is broken, and I appreciate that there have been conversations on both sides of the aisle about how to fix it. But this is one thing that we can do this year that could become law that would open up a pathway, improve our workforce, and allow individuals to serve this body. I'm not saying everybody has to employ an individual with DACA status, but those of us who have come across individuals with DACA status, if we want to employ them, we're prohibited from doing that now. This bill, this amendment is simple. It would fix that ineligibility, and it would allow us to hire individuals with DACA status. As I said, just by process, Democrats and Republicans have supported this exact text in the past. Whether Democrats have had the gavel or Republicans have had the gavel, this amendment has succeeded. And while there is much that we are going to disagree on, and there are items that we're going to have to go to conference with, some incredibly very substantive pieces over the next 3 or 4 months, my hope is that we can put this language in the bill, have it as a marker, go over to the Senate and have conversations about a reform that we can do that affects this institution that would unlock opportunity for a lot of young people within our communities. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Abade is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the remarks of my colleague and friend from the south end of the Golden State. We've worked together on things before, actually on this issue, on some things before. I think a little bit of history here helps to start for explaining why I'm going to end up in opposition. This was included in the last Congress from the House and didn't survive the Senate conference process. Nobody, I am not saying I know why or what, but I know it was sent over and for whatever reason, those folks stripped it out. We also talk about, when we talk about DACA and all the work that needs to be done, to now come forward and say, in the context of what we really need to do for DACA, we are going to carve out a tiny postage stamp exemption for ourselves. If you can get a job in the U.S. Congress, then guess what? You're no longer, there's no longer a DACA issue for you. I think that's the height of disrespect for those people who deserve a heck of a lot more. And to say, hey, we've done something for you if you can find a job with one of us, is not the message we need to send to the rest of the Congress or to the country. I don't need to remind anybody in this room that it's been since 1980-something, when President Reagan was the president, since we've taken on immigration reform. And I don't need to remind anybody that whether you liked what President Obama did in his administration, or Trump did in his, or Biden did in his, the reason all of those administrations on both sides of the aisle started doing the executive order drill is because this branch of government didn't get anything passed. Now, that's not all our fault. I mean, let's face it, the Senate deserves their credit. The committees with actual jurisdiction, and for this amendment, it's probably House Admin and Judiciary's floating around somewhere. But you sit there with one side saying, well, our base this, and the other side saying that, and we have, there's a line in the Constitution, God knows I'm not a constitutional scholar, nothing from you, Mr. Clyde, that says the Congress will establish a system of naturalization. We're supposed to do immigration, and we haven't done it, regardless of who the speaker's been or hasn't been, or who's been in the White House or who hasn't. So I would just say this. I'm willing to stand arm in arm with anybody who wants to take on comprehensively this issue in a truly collaborative fashion, and immigration as a whole. But unfortunately, this is not the place to do this tiny exemption, and therefore, I don't want to set the precedent here tonight by saying, yeah, we can throw a little dart into an appropriations bill and see how that works when it's clearly House Admin and it's clearly Judiciary. Although if somebody wants to, well, I won't even go down that road. I oppose the bill regretfully.
Mr. Espaillat?
Thank you, Madam Chair. DACA has been transformative for the lives of hundreds and thousands of young people brought to the United States at a very early age, and has resulted in real economic gains for cities, states, and our nation. More than 3/4 of DACA recipients participate in the labor force, contributing an estimated $13.3 billion to the U.S. economy each year. That includes $6.2 billion in federal taxes and $3.3 billion in state and local taxes every year. In this country, there's about 644,000 current DACA recipients, 61,000 dreamers that are looking to be eligible for DACA, and 1.3 DACA eligible people. And so this is, they are here with us. And I knew a young boy who was a DACA, sort of like a DACA recipient, and I knew of his feelings about perhaps not being able to get a job in this nation because he came at a very early age with his parents. And the kind of trepidation and fears faced by this young boy every day. I knew him really well. In fact, I probably knew him better than anybody else in the world because that young boy was me. And now I'm a member of Congress. And so if we can't do it across the country, let's do it here. If we don't have the will, Chairman Amade, to do it through judiciary and impact the entire nation, why not showcase it here and show the political bipartisan will that we have to provide the opportunities for the young people right here in the Capitol, in the legislative branch? I think it would send a great message that we can work together, that perhaps we can do here what we cannot do in the greater community, in the country, but that we have at least hope to be able to address that someday as well, because we're able to get it done today here. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. It is a good amendment, a humane amendment.
May I respond to what you just said, sir?
Excuse me.
I just want to
I
say,
yield back.
what you just said not only can happen, it should happen. If we can't do things, then how can we expect it to happen in our schools and places to work, that sort of thing? So I would encourage you, and I would love to help you with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Aguilar is recognized for 1 minute to close. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Ms. Wasserman.
I apologize.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in strong support of the amendment by my friend, Mr. Aguilar. This amendment, as you know, would clear the path for young people with deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA status to enter government service in the United States Congress. And, you know, I can appreciate the sentiment that this would only be a tiny bit of progress and that we, you know, would be better off really going for the larger goal of immigration reform. I've been here a decent amount of time now and seen many fits and starts and attempts to accomplish that. I've seen lots of advocacy to try to move forward with the low-hanging fruit, which includes this item and H-2B reform and the student visas, and the list goes on. And, you know, they always argue that we need those as sweeteners to be able to make sure that the more difficult issues in comprehensive immigration reform are an easier pill to swallow. This is an opportunity for us to lead. It's an opportunity for us to set an example. And Mr. Amade, I understand what you're saying. Every bit of progress we've ever made in this country started with a tiny speck of progress. And I can tell you, I had a number of years ago a wonderful dreamer intern who, as she was finishing college, was about to go out into the job market, and we wanted to keep her here. And lo and behold, we realized that we were prohibited from hiring her as a staff assistant. She was lawfully here. She had the ability to, be a productive member of our society, to earn an income and build her future. And that's still the case today. But we have this unreasonable obstacle that doesn't allow us to hire the best and brightest, no matter their lawful immigration status, which DACA recipients have. We're the elected representatives of the American people. We have a duty to make sure that we can hire the best and brightest serving our country. I would ask some of our friends on the other side of the aisle to look at some of the questionable hires that your colleagues have made, some of whom are associated with white supremacist organizations or are neo-Nazis, and I'm not making that up. That's stuff that's been reported in the not fake news. Maybe we should review our policies on a little more deeply on who we allow members to hire, because we have some pretty suspicious characters among us that don't include dreamers. DACA recipients are already working as doctors, teachers, lawyers, scientists, virtually every professional field there is. And the dreamers represent the type of ambitious and dedicated individuals that would strengthen the federal government's workforce. We should be breaking down barriers. We should be setting an example here. We should show the United States what we're made of here. It's a shameful decision not to allow this small, tiny speck of progress. And if we keep these barriers in place, we'd be failing not just the dreamers, but this entire nation, because every American deserves the best government that we can provide. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Siscomani first.
I need to call on Mr. Siscomani first. He was ahead of you. Then we'll come to you.
Thank you for recognizing me. This is obviously a near and dear issue to my heart. I grew up with a lot of the students that we're referring to today as DACA students. And this is an issue of opportunity for me. This is an issue of giving everybody a chance that has been part of our community, has been part of our society. And although I do agree that we need a larger approach on this, one that solves the issue at heart and the way it needs to be, this is recognized as a small step, I think, in the right direction. Doesn't solve the issue, but it is a small step. And at this point, I'll take any step that is being taken in the right direction of giving these students an opportunity to succeed, an opportunity at life, an opportunity to have a chance to pursue their dreams, especially given that they're in this country at no choice of their own, and definitely no fault of their own as well, given their circumstances. So, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Cartwright, in recognition.
First, I'd like to associate myself with the words of Mr. Siscomani. Thank you for those remarks. Chairman Amadei, I have worked with you also on several things, and I find you to be a man of not only abundant great humor, but also a deep thinker. Well, this is good. Oh, and a good-looking man, too. Reclaiming my time, Mr. Espaillat and Ms. Wasserman-Schultz took the words out of my mouth when they talked about leadership. You say, well, it does a little bit, but why don't we go the whole hog, and why bother weighing in on small starts like this. The truth is, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. Let's do it. That's number one. And you know, Mr. Chairman, you get a minute to close, and I hope you will address these 2 points. Number one, why shouldn't we lead? Why shouldn't we be examples for the American people? And number two, you voted for this before. All of us did. There was a point that Chairman Aguilar made very well. We voted for this. And if I recall correctly, you said you didn't know why the Senate stripped it out. I don't know why they did either. I can't think of a good reason. So I hope you will address those 2 things, in particular. What changed? What changed this year that you don't want to vote for this amendment where you did before? Yield back.
Ms. Bice is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to first say that I am the daughter of an immigrant. I believe in immigration, but I believe in legal immigration. And I think it's disingenuous for my friends across the aisle to talk about taking a first step. And here's why I say that. Last Congress, I filed a bill that would have taken a very small step in allowing individuals to stay an extended period of time on a temporary visa. Pretty innocuous, in my opinion. Was bipartisan. It was led on the other side by Scott Peters. Never got considered. Never even got close to being considered. You all had the majority. You had the majority in the House, in the Senate, in the White House, and it still wouldn't be considered. So if we're going to talk about immigration, it's got to be in a bipartisan fashion. It can't be one side or the other. And I do believe that we have to look at immigration reform comprehensively, but it needs to be done overall. It can't be these bits and pieces because it's never going anywhere. And so I oppose the amendment. I respect and appreciate the gentleman from California putting this forward, but I think that we need to come together and look at this comprehensively. And for that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Aguilar, I recognize.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair. Obviously, if we could do everything at one time, when all of us say that the system is broken, we would have done it. But I used a comment in the bill that we did that made sure we didn't violate the debt limit and put the economy into a spin, about a little statement that was used about donut shop in Nantucket. Essentially when it said, brother, as you go through life, keep your eye upon the donut and not upon the hole. The donut here is we have 800,000 to maybe 1.5 million young people, for the most part, who came here because their parents wanted opportunity. My father came from Denmark at the age of 32 in 1934 because he was seeking opportunity. Dick Durbin and I and Mr. McCarthy and John Cornyn were at the White House. I was sitting next to the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And we talked about these DACA students, or doctors, or lawyers, whoever those DACA people, men and women were. And Donald Trump turned to me and he said, send me a bill and I'll sign it. In part, I think he did that because 85% of the American people support doing just that, giving them a path to citizenship. I'm sure many of you have met with DACA, those who are described as in the DACA position. I've met with hundreds. They're all extraordinary young people. America has succeeded because it accepted millions of people like those DACA students, like your parents. Mr. Amadei, you and I are friends, or as you call it, the fellow Metformin caucus. This is a small step supported by 85% of America. We ought to take it. We ought to take it proudly. As the chair said, if we can take small steps that will lead to progress and awareness of one another, then we will have had a good day. It's easy to say no. I know perhaps that 15% who don't think we ought to do DACA maybe are the people that you're hearing from. But I would hope in this instance that we would make a judgment that is based upon our humanity, based upon the principles of our country as a place of opportunity, and show that indeed it is a place of opportunity for kids who came here, some at 1 or 2 or 3 years of age, went to elementary school here, went to high school here, went to college here, pledged allegiance to the flag of the United States, one nation under God, indivisible. It's a step we can take. It doesn't do everything. It doesn't solve all the problems. It won't allay nativism or xenophobia or racism. It won't do any of that. But it will take a small step. And I think all of us can say we took a small step today. We took a small step together, not divided, not 34-27, 34-27. But say, in this instance, we agree with the 85% of the American public who says, yes, these kids ought to be treated by what they are, Americans. They know no other country. They know no other land. This is their country. One nation, under God. Mr. Aguilar has a good, simple, straightforward, very consequential for about 1.5 million, maybe a few more. But it will have a big statement about the fact that this Congress could come together in this instance, on this evening, for a principle that America believes in. A place of opportunity, and yes, a place of refuge. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Mr. Zinke is recognized.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Zinke is recognized. Where?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you. And I agree with almost everything you said, sir. I agree with a good gentleman from Maryland on almost everything he said, except I love the Constitution. You know, and our founding fathers were very clever. And they must have thought it was important because they put it up front in Article 1, Section 9, about appropriations. And our job is to appropriate, not to authorize. And I agree. Policy is important. And there's a lot of policy we agree on. I don't think there's a member here that would agree on that we can't go and exercise on appropriations unless we appropriate it at all. And the conveniences we have created among this body, whether it's mandated, discretionary, pick one, omnibus, continuing resolutions, all of those wonderful tricks have prevented us from doing our job, which is appropriate. Now, I agree, DACA's got to be fixed. It's unfair. Those kids who go across the border, they don't know anything but their parents, and sometimes they don't even have that. When a kid grows up in school, and I've had DACA kids that have served, and they've served for this country. So I agree, we got to fix it. But appropriations gives and takes away funds. It does not do policy. So on this side, I agree with the chair that we absolutely need to fix DACA, and I think we can as a body. I do. But in appropriations, it is not appropriate to have this. I yield back.
Mr. Aguilar is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the comments from colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I really do, and I agree with the gentleman from Maryland. I want to take steps, and you saw
us to vote floor time for some of those steps in a bipartisan way. The Dream and Promise Act to fix this for DACA and Dreamers and TPS holders, the Farm Worker Modernization Act, which a lot of your members supported as well. Those two items would have put a path to citizenship for millions of people. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about that authorization that passed in the last Congress that got stuck in the Senate. We're talking about the ability of Congress to expend dollars, to my colleague in Montana, hiring individuals irrespective of their status. That's what we're talking about. That is the question before us, whether we should or whether we shouldn't. Democrats and Republicans have supported this language in the past, in this room, in this body. Now, I would take one issue with what the chairman said. Mr. Chairman, you said if we're going to confine our, my response is, if we're going to confine our actions to things that only can pass the Senate, it's going to be, you're going to produce a product about that much. We can do better. You know we can do better. We all know we can do better. These young people know we can do better. This isn't a postage stamp fix. This isn't a dart. We can do a lot better. We should do that here. We should vote for this amendment. We should put this in the bill. We should send it over. We should fight for this text. And we should ensure that we can hire these young people to serve and walk these halls of Congress where you walk these halls of Congress. Yield back.
The question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Aguilar. And those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
She's just reading from the paper. She didn't. Oh, absolutely won't.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number is in support. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, no. Mr. Bishop.
Yes.
Mr. Bishop, yes. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, yes. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, aye. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, no. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar. Ms. DeLauro.
Yes.
Ms. DeLauro, yes. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey, no. Mr. Espaillat.
Yes.
Mr. Espaillat, yes. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, yes. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, no. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Granger.
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, no. Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Mrs. Henson. Mrs. Henson, no. Mr. Hoyer.
Aye.
Mr. Hoyer, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter.
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. LaTurner, no. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California, aye. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, aye. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, no. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, aye. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Morelli.
Aye.
Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, aye. Ms. Underwood. Ms. Underwood, yes. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, yes. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, yes. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, no. Mr. Cuellar is not recorded. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Newhouse is not recorded. Mr. Newhouse, aye.
Or their vote or change their vote.
Might be 31-29. I think it's 31-29. Assuming everybody.
Clerk will tally.
The chair voted opposite of what she argued.
She voted, the chair.
The chair voted. She voted no. She argued yes and voted no.
On this vote, the ayes are 28, the noes are 30. The amendment is not adopted.
Well, I was right on two. There's a margin of two.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Clyde is.
Mr. Clyde? Mr. Clyde is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk, and I request that we dispense with the reading of the amendment. I request that we dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Thank you. Without objection.
Thank you. Part of the role of the Appropriations Committee is to cut wasteful spending through the annual appropriations process. Therefore, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, which would reduce the inaugural budget from $22 million to $11 million, which is still $4 million above the FY20 appropriation of $7 million. At the time when our surging national debt just exceeded $32 trillion, Congress must afford extra scrutiny to requests for increased funding. So I'd like to give some context to my amendment here. According to the architect of the Capitol, the AOC budget for inaugural activities in 2008, when President Obama was inaugurated, it was $3.6 million. In 2012, it was $4.2 million. In FY16, it was $4.7 million, and in FY20, it was $7 million. However, the FY24 request is a whopping $22 million, more than a 200% increase. The architect of the Capitol supplied this committee with the budget comparison for FY20 and FY24, which I have here. And interestingly, their reasoning for the budget boost was enhanced security and inflation. Well, even in the midst of a heightened security posture for the FY20 inaugural ceremony, which caused the AOC to go significantly over budget at $7 million, the funding for FY24 of $22 million is over triple FY20. Furthermore, excluding the additional security measures such as fencing and barriers, the proposed construction costs are inconsistent with claims of inflation. For example, the task labeled inaugural platform and stands, bleachers, media stands, ramps, and crossovers for FY24 represents a 92% increase over 2020. Leasing and space furnishings is a 169% increase. For implementation, an 872% increase, and for miscellaneous, a 90% increase.
It's no secret that our nation has been facing a significant economic crisis in recent years. However, even the most devastating inflation rate, according to the Consumer Price Index, capped out at 9.1% in June of 2022. Now, understandably, there's a difference between the monthly CPI percentages and cumulative price increases, which is roughly a 19% inflation rate from 2019 to 2023. So regardless of which statistic you use, the architect of the Capitol, in my opinion, fails to provide a legitimate justification for a 214% budget increase. In an effort to understand the budget request better, I met with the architect of the Capitol for further explanation, yet in my opinion, they failed to address most of my concerns and questions. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to reduce the FY24 budget to $11 million, which is still a 57% increase over the FY 2020 budget to account for legitimate inflation and security expenditures, while also reining in excessive spending. So I urge a yes vote on my amendment, and I will also mention that should the AOC be able to justify this massive 214% increase, or part of it, between now and the time that this bill comes to the floor for a vote, I'm open to offering an amendment on the floor to back any additional necessary funding. I yield back.
Mr. Amadei is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is always a pleasure to rise in any debate context to discuss something with my colleague from the Peach State. He is right that this has gone up $11 million. He is right that we have said, hey, can you give us some more for this, that, or the other? It is a fact that this inaugural will take place, it was the first one that will take place in a post-January 6th context. It is a fact that during the January 6th reaction, that unscalable, whatever the heck the right name for the fence is, was costing over $1 million a week to rent. I'm not saying that's, you like that number, you don't like that number, whatever. I went to the architect of the Capitol at the time and said, what are we paying for that fence? And the number was north of $1 million a week. A lot of money, but anyhow. So it is a fact that for this inaugural, there is going to be more of that fence covering a larger area. Now that's me telling you that. We have met with the architect of the Capitol twice. More detail, please, because it is a fair thing. And for those of you who don't know this, Mr. Clyde is a former purchasing officer. Why are y'all looking at me with such solemn looks on your face? And so as a former purchasing officer, he asked what we should do in this committee. How come it costs so much? How come the price went up so much? And so we asked the architect of the Capitol, come in and hang some more meat on those bones. And they hung some more meat on it, but they're still round numbers. $7 million that it would be nice to know why. Instead of just security fencing, building the whatever. Now listen, nobody thinks anything's gone down. So you got lumber, you got different design requirements. You got obviously heightened security stuff. I will end with this and say, as long as Mr. Clyde is, and I think you just said that, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, willing to meet again with members from both sides and the architect of the Capitol before we go to the floor on this bill, if it's okay with the chair and the ranking member, to go, hey, you've had 2 bites at the apple, you get a third one, and no, fill in the blank, we really want the detail to support that kind of increase. Then I'm happy to accept the amendment, but if it's cut half of it and hope to heck we don't do something stupid in a security sense. And by the way, I'm not saying whether the Senate will do it or won't do it, but let's be serious, folks. Both sides have traded, why are you doing this? Because it'll never become law when it gets through the other side. We've heard that line before. But I'm willing to accept the amendment with Mr. Clyde putting on the record we have more work to do with those folks, and what they justify will come back for floor work when it comes to the floor.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Yes.
That's an ideal situation if that plays out the way you suggest. Mr. Clyde, once it leaves here, and once we send it, we know that we don't have as much control when something leaves the Appropriations Committee. And so, what do you say in response to the concern that while Mr. Clyde might feel more comfortable about it, there are a whole lot of other people that have a say-so once it gets to the House floor? And if we can't get that funding back in, then we've cut it potentially dangerously, and we might not be in a situation where we can make that restoration.
Then I would advise you to vote against the Clyde Amendment.
Well, I plan to, but I was just asking you to consider that.
Well, you asked the question, there's my answer.
Yeah, okay, that's a little bit risky for my take. Thank you.
Mr. Espaillat is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank Chairman Amador for his ideas on how to deal with this issue on the House floor. Although a significant number of our colleagues have not been privy to this, necessarily to this debate and the content of it. But I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. This is funding for the construction of stands necessary for the inauguration in the post-January 6th era. And I may remind you that our campus was attacked again, a second time. After that terrible date. And so to compromise on our ability to be safe, I think puts us all in peril, and the future president, no matter what party he or she may belong to, could be in danger, and better safe than sorry. And so we are requesting a no vote, and for this construction project to continue at that level of funding, where it would meet the safety criteria that we all feel comfortable with for ourselves and those that will participate in the inauguration ceremonies. Keeping our campus safe is of paramount importance. It should be of paramount importance for visitors, staff, as well as our colleagues. And so I ask all our members, including my colleagues on my side of the aisle, to vote nay on this amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Morelli is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also rise in opposition to the amendment. I will associate myself with the remarks made by my colleague and friend, Mr. Espaillat. But remember, this is not only about the president, whoever that individual may be, but around the campus and around the Capitol complex during the inauguration of power and potentially the peaceful transfer of power. You have seen and we have witnessed on January 6th the tremendous pressure put on Capitol Police, on our security complex. And this is not only about the president and his or her staff, but it's also members of Congress. It is the public, tens of thousands of people who come here. We need to make sure, and I would also associate myself with the questions asked by Ms. Wasserman Schultz, which is, why would we cut short the funding? We're not required to spend it. If we find that there are more efficient ways to do this, that's one thing, and that would allow us to not spend the money. But to cut by $11 million, this after a request from the architect of the Capitol, seems to me extremely irresponsible and could lead to a very dangerous situation. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Clyde is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Madam Chair, thank you, Madam Chair. You know, look, I'm all about funding the 2025 inaugural ceremony and making sure that it is safe at appropriate levels. But when you go in 2008 from $3.6 million to do the same thing in 2012 at $4.2 million, and in 2016 at $4.7 million, and then in 2021 after January 6th was $7 million, stepping from $7 million to $22.0 million seems beyond explanation, and so far it has been. So, but I commit to the chair that if we get to sit down with the architect of the Capitol, I will certainly be happy to provide any sort of amendment necessary if they can indeed come to the table and explain their $22 million increase. Thank you. And I yield back.
The question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Clyde. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is adopted. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amaday.
Yes.
Mr. Amaday, yes. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Yes. Mr. Carl, yes. Mr. Carter. Yes. Mr. Carter, yes. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. No. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Granger. Aye. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Henson. Mrs. Henson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Captor. Ms. Captor, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rupersberger. Mr. Rupersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Ms. Underwood. Ms. Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, yes. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, aye. Mr. Stewart, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? The clerk will tally. On this vote,
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
is recognized.
I ask that the reading be dispensed.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member is recognized for open remarks of the amendment.
Madam Chair, I rise to offer an amendment to uphold current law that provides and prohibits outside earned income from members of Congress as directed by the Ethics Reform Act of 1989. While it is honorable for members of Congress who are trained and licensed medical doctors to wish to practice while they serve in Congress, allowing this will set a difficult precedent. As a reminder, under the Ethics Reform Act, members are prohibited from engaging in professions that provide services involving a fiduciary relationship. There are two reasons for establishing or limiting outside employment for members of Congress. First, these professional activities were believed to pose a particular risk of conflict of interest. Second, there was a desire to ensure that payments for services provided voluntarily remain banned from outside interests. This language is also out of step with current law, which prohibits members of Congress from earning income in the field of law, engineering, architecture, real estate, insurance, and consulting. I am offering this amendment to uphold current law, and I urge all my colleagues to vote yes for it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Amadei is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield my time in opposition to my colleague from Maryland, Mr. Harris.
Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman, offering the amendment to describe why it's so necessary. So the gentleman, first of all, says that in statute somehow they mention medicine. They don't. Go back and look at the Ethics Reform Act of 1989. It was an interpretation of a committee years later that suggested that medicine should be included, and then the Ethics Committee itself changed the rule in 2003 to exclude medicine. In fact, if you take your House Rules book, Rule 25, it says that you can't receive compensation for practicing a profession that involves a fiduciary relationship except for the practice of medicine. Those are the House rules. Now, you mentioned medical doctors, but if you go to the Ethics Committee and ask them their interpretation of the word medicine, they actually include dentistry, they actually include nursing, they actually include all the health professions. So what we're doing, if we don't change this incongruity, because remember, 1989, you passed the Ethics Reform Act. Subsequent to that, you convene a committee to kind of decide how to define fiduciary because the Ethics Reform Act is not defined. Congress made a mistake. They should have defined it. This committee defines it. The Rules Committee of the House defines it differently. The result being that we've had physicians like Tom Coburn, we've had dentists in the House who had to give up their practice because of the incongruity of these rules. Now, the question is, should we in fact consider, should we make the statute, the small change in statute, that by the way is not just medicine, it's medicine and dentistry in the statute. And remember, the Ethics Committee has defined the practice of medicine as including things like advanced practice nurses. Now, why this is essential is because if you think we should have or promote a citizen legislature of some kind, where people actually go to Congress, do a job, and then go back, the problem is that for someone working like when I did, and I don't practice anymore, so it won't apply to me, but if you work in a hospital or systems-based practice, you can lose your credentialing if you stop practicing. And once you lose credentialing, not necessarily your license, but credentialing, it's very hard to re-enter because some institutions make you actually go back and do training again. So it makes complete sense, since this does not remove the limitation on earnings. Remember, the limitation on earnings is 15% above level 2 in the senior executive service, the base pay of level 2 senior executive service. You're subject to the same limitations. I tell people all the time when I explain this, if I flip burgers at McDonald's, I can earn 15% additional salary of the level 2 senior executive service. But if I take care of a patient, I can't. To a lot of people, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, and there's an incongruity. The House Rules has said this shouldn't apply to medicine. The committee that looked at to define fiduciary after the Reform Act said it should. I think it shouldn't. Now, this is a judgment call. Judgment call. I think you can make a case that, especially since we spend so much money training health professionals. As the gentleman knows, for instance, if you're a physician, taxpayer paid for my training under GME, Medicare GME. They paid for my training, and now we're going to say, don't worry about that money we paid. We're going to keep a rule, or we're going to keep a practice that negates that training. You can't go back and function again. So I would, with that, I will yield back to the chair, and I appreciate solving this incongruity that's existed for a long time and prevented some of our healthcare practitioners and dentists from practicing.
Reclaiming my time, Madam Chair, I will be opposing Mr. Espaillat's amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Lauro is recognized.
I rise in support of this amendment, and I thank the ranking member for offering it. You know, it was just last week in the Agricultural Appropriations Bill. Republicans voted to take food from women, infants, and children. They slashed the monthly funds provided for WIC participants to buy fruits and vegetables by as much as about 70%, drastically underfunding the WIC account itself at a time of rising participation and food costs. Enable farmer foreclosure over farming by rescinding the funds provided to assist farmers and ranchers who are underwater in their FSA loans. Hinder the ability of the Secretary to assist farmers under the Commodity Credit Corporation. At the same time, the majority is slashing funding for these and other investments to help working families. Members of Congress shouldn't be able to use the appropriations process for their own financial gain, whether they can now or not, or just, that's not a precedent that we should set. It's just not right. It really isn't right. I'm not going to go on. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of Mr. Espaillat's amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Espillet is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, if we allow this amendment to pass, of course, it will continue to ensure that other professions decide not to opt in. So we support this amendment, and we feel that it will open up the door for questionable financial transactions if we continue to open up the door to new professions. So it's a clear line in the sand that will keep the process of government and private practice separate and apart. And I yield back the remaining part of my time. I ask for a vote, a yes vote.
The question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Espelay. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it and the amendment is adopted. It's not adopted, sorry. Are there any further amendments? I now recognize Mr. Rogers for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move to favorably report the fiscal year 2024 Legislative Branch Appropriations Bill to the House.
The question is now on the motion to favorably report the fiscal year 2024 Legislative Branch Appropriations Bill to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the motion is agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand.
Who the hell said that? I want to know who asked for a recorded vote.
A sufficient number in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. No. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amadei. Yes. Mr. Amadei, yes. Mrs. Bice. Yes. Mrs. Bice, yes. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, yes. Mr. Carl. Yes. Mr. Carl, yes. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, yes. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, yes. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, yes. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, yes. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez. Ms. Granger. Aye. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Henson. Mrs. Henson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Oh, Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger? Just want to make sure, did he correct it? Mr. Ruppersberger? No. Okay. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, yes. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, yes. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman? Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, yes. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? The clerk will tally.
Mr. Ruppersberger is recorded as a no.
Something, yeah. Thank you. On this vote, the ayes are 33, the noes are 24. It is not adopted.
Is adopted.
Is adopted. Okay, sorry, is adopted. I ask unanimous consent that staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, so ordered. That concludes today's business. Yippee. Within objections, the committee stands adjourned.